There comes a point in life when a person stops trying to be chosen and quietly begins choosing themselves instead. It's not something they announce. In fact, most people around them don't even notice it at first. But you can see it in the way they no longer wait for replies, no longer chase conversations, no longer rearrange their day just to feel included. If something in that feels familiar, stay with me for a moment. Because this shift, though quiet, is often one of the most important transitions a person will ever experience. And if you've been sensing it in your own life, perhaps without fully understanding it, you're not imagining it. There was a time when being included meant everything. A message left unanswered could linger in your thoughts for hours. A change in someone's tone could alter your mood for the entire day. You paid attention, closely, not just to what people said, but to what they didn't say. But gradually, something begins to change. You start noticing how often you were the one initiating, the one adjusting, the one making space, even when no one asked you to. And at first, this realization doesn't lead to action. It leads to reflection. You replay moments, conversations, silences, not with resentment, but with clarity. One of the first subtle shifts is how you begin to respond to inconsistency. You no longer try to decode it endlessly. When someone shows up unpredictably, warm one day, distant the next, you stop trying to stabilize it. You let it be what it is. And more importantly, you begin to decide whether that pattern deserves a place in your life. Then there's the change in how you experience waiting. You used to wait for replies, for plans, for people to follow through. Now waiting feels different. Not because time has changed, but because your relationship with it has. You no longer pause your life in anticipation of someone else's decision. Another shift appears in your conversations. You begin to notice when you're not truly being heard, not just interrupted, but overlooked. And instead of trying harder to be understood, you slowly begin to speak less in those spaces, not out of withdrawal, but out of recognition. There's also a quiet change in how you handle effort. You still care, you still give, but you become more aware of where that effort is going. You start to notice when it's not being met, not in equal measure, but in genuine presence. And when it isn't, you don't always address it directly. Sometimes you simply redirect your energy. Around this point, something deeper often surfaces, a memory. Not a dramatic one, but a subtle pattern from the past. Times when you overextended yourself, when you said yes too quickly, when you stayed available, even when it cost you your own sense of balance. If one of those memories just crossed your mind, and it carries a quiet understanding rather than regret, then you're already seeing the pattern more clearly than before. And if this reflection feels like it's putting words to something you've been living through silently, consider allowing yourself to stay present with that awareness. Because sometimes recognition is the beginning of a boundary you didn't know you needed. What's happening beneath all of this is not detachment from others. It's a reattachment to yourself. Psychologically, this shift often marks the movement from external dependency toward internal stability. Earlier in life, much of our sense of worth is shaped by how we are received, how quickly people respond, how warmly they engage, how consistently they show up. And when that response is inconsistent, we try to compensate. We give more, adjust more, explain more. But over time, especially after repeated experiences, something begins to settle. You start asking a different question. Not, why aren't they choosing me? But why am I choosing this? And that question changes everything. Because once you begin to examine your own patterns, not with judgment, but with honesty, you start to see where your energy has been going. Not just to people, but to expectations, to imagined outcomes, to roles you've outgrown. There is also a growing comfort in stepping back without explanation. You begin to understand that not every distance needs to be announced. Not every boundary needs to be defended. Sometimes it's enough to simply not return to what no longer feels right. This doesn't mean you stop valuing connection. In fact, you begin to value it more, but in a different way. You look for consistency, for presence, for a sense of ease that doesn't require constant maintenance. And when you find it, you recognize it immediately because you've experienced the opposite. There's also a noticeable shift in how you respond to being misunderstood. It used to bother you more. You would clarify, explain, try to realign how others saw you. Now there's less urgency. You begin to understand that being seen clearly by everyone is not a requirement for living honestly. And that realization brings a kind of quiet freedom. You may also notice that your emotional reactions become more measured, not suppressed, but grounded. You don't feel the same pull to respond immediately. There's a pause, a moment where you check in with yourself before engaging. And in that pause, you often find your answer. Perhaps one of the most significant changes is this. You begin to feel comfortable walking away from what once felt important. Not dramatically, not with resentment, but with a calm sense of completion. You don't need closure in the way you once did. You don't need the final conversation, the perfect explanation, the mutual understanding. You just need clarity within yourself. And once you have that, you move differently. If you've recognized yourself in these patterns, if something here reflects a shift you've been quietly experiencing, then you're not becoming distant. You're becoming discerning. And that discernment is not about pushing people away. It's about allowing the right ones to stay without having to chase them. Channel name. Thanks you for listening and being part of this reflection. So if your world feels a little quieter lately, if your circle feels smaller but more stable, if your energy feels more protected than before, that's not loss. That's alignment. And it often begins the moment you realize you were never meant to be chosen by everyone, only to stop abandoning yourself in the process.